Welcome to episode 64 of the Food Grads Podcast, a podcast where we explore careers in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. I'm your host, Veronica Hislop, a PhD candidate in molecular science and career partner with Food Grads. This week on the podcast, I interviewed Abby Thiel, researcher at Wageningen University and Research. Welcome to episode 65 of the Food Grads Podcast, the podcast where we explore careers in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. I'm your host, Veronica Hislop, a PhD candidate in molecular science and career partner with Food Grads. This week on the podcast, I interviewed Doug Alexander, Vice President of Sustainability and Government Relations at Belmont Meats. Belmont Meats is a leader in the manufacturing and processing of food service and retail burger products since 1966. In this episode, Doug walked me through his career journey, starting from when he first graduated with a degree in chemistry to his now current role in sustainability and government relations. Doug spent a lot of time throughout the episode talking about the how and the why he transitioned from each of his roles. I learned about each of the roles and what they entailed, but more so how he has had a rich career full of many roles. So hearing how he moved to each was great. And with a little bit of the dynamics behind the scenes, which is something that you don't always hear about when listening about why people make choices in their careers. We also talked about managing failures in your role and why they aren't the end of the world, even though at the time they might seem like it. Finally, we rounded the episode by Doug giving advice to those who are thinking about pursuing a career on the manufacturing side of the industry. Hearing Doug talk about all those different career roles was really interesting, and it really goes to show that you can build a long career path within this industry. Well, I will let Doug take it away and talk about his own career path. So, enough with that introduction. Let's get on with the show. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Doug, for taking time to come on the show. I put out a message on LinkedIn that I was looking to interview some more people who are on the manufacturing side of the food industry because a lot of you individuals don't like to have as much of a social media presence, which is understandably so. But I'm so happy that I got your name put in, and thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, I think that you would be able to do a much better job at explaining who you are than I can. So why don't we get started by talking about what your current role is, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so I'm currently Vice President of Sustainability and Government Relations. Predominantly, that involves ESG initiatives as well as industry and government relations. So, being on boards of industry associations like Food and Beverage Ontario, Meat and Poultry Ontario, on the Innovation Advisory Council of the Food Innovations Network, as well as the chair of the Agricultural Adaptation Council.
Very busy man.
And you know what? For the last 10 years, I've been, more than that, probably 15. I've been spending a fair amount of my time reinvesting back into an industry that's done very well by me.
Before we continue on to just talk about your career path, you said the term ESG, and I just want to make sure what does that mean?
Environmental, social responsibility, and good governance. So ESG is a very
Okay.
common topic, and not that many people really fully understand it, but essentially, it's really just giving yourself credit for all the good things you do.
Okay. Well, I know that we're going to start to talk about that as we continue in your role. And one of the reasons I wanted to get you on is to just walk us through your career path, because I think that there's been a lot of you didn't take a role where you were a plant manager for 20 years and then here you are. You've done a lot of different things, and I'd love to start from when you if you want to start from when you got out of school because you have a chemistry degree. Like, how did you get into manufacturing? And like, let's just go through that journey.
Sure. So finishing up high school, I had the opportunity, because I couldn't afford it, to take a year off and rethink what the heck I was going to do. And some of my classmates, when we had grade 13, went on into medical school and engineering and a few other professions. And I really wasn't quite sure what to do. So taking the year to save some money, worked full time. And I decided, I asked my mom, what should I do? And she said, don't work in auto. Those jobs stop and start. But if you work in the food industry, you'll have a job for life. I'm like, why? People got to eat. So at the end of the day, aside from oxygen and water, and there's not a lot of industry around oxygen production, but the food industry certainly has been incredibly good for me. And so the program I signed up for was out of Fanshawe College. It was a 4-year program at the time, co-op in science, and my specialty was food chemistry with a minor in food and industrial microbiology. So it was all about food. I did my 3 work terms. I had a little over a year's experience before graduating, all at Kellogg's in London in the QA lab, working in various areas. My first job was predominantly environmental.
Mhm.
I had no expectation that full circle I would end up focusing in on that. At the time, I would just put on some sort of layers and go down into the sewer and take samples and do DOD analysis,
It's important job that I'm wondering.
juice as we'd call it, and take it up into the lab and do the analysis. And I also did packaging analysis. Then I moved more into cereal, and my thesis paper was on HPLC chemistry, chemical analysis for sugars. And the HPLC was brand new at the time, and we had one. So I had the good
Wow.
fortune. So co-op, I think, is a great way, especially to do science because you get a chance to do practical. I was very fortunate to have all my work terms in London, where I went to school and and lived. And so had a good practical work term experience. And when I graduated, a company called Canada Packers, which became Maple Leaf Foods, had a management training program that would recruit in about 200 graduates a year across the country. And our school had about 10 people interviewed, they had narrowed it down to about 4. 2 of us that were really close friends accepted. One fellow with an environmental specialty, Jeff, ended up in sales in the Caribbean selling edible oils. What an adventure. And now he's in human resources somewhere, senior in a company. But life's an adventure. And so when I joined, I accepted a job at Canada Packers, and I started right in corporate industrial engineering. And I'm like, what's corporate industrial engineering?
Okay. Okay. That's what I'm wondering. Okay.
What fats, oils, and lipids are. I could tell you about, what's Listeria or E. coli, but what's industrial engineering and why am I
Mhm.
here? But it was the management training program, and part of the development was you had abilities and aspirations to go beyond that. In those days, we called him the snowman. He was the corporate recruiter, Phil Renouf, and he hired 200 people, all of which were going to become the president of the company. It was about 20,000 employees, and yeah, it might have become a bit of a crowded field, but we all were fairly ambitious. We were all fairly hardworking, and we wanted to be rewarded for our efforts. And it really wasn't about a linear stream in our careers. What we learned very quickly was school taught you how to learn, and then you started learning when you started working. And so going into a completely alien environment like industrial engineering, the purpose was for me to become an operational expert, to understand how cost of goods sold, how efficiencies are, how products are produced en masse. And they, in return, they would send me back to school. So I continued my education. Some of it was accelerated, some of it was through Conestoga, Waterloo, and a
Mhm.
number of other schools as I continued. I really liked it, actually. It turned out I had a bit of an affinity for efficiency. And so, I started right in production operations through corporate industrial engineering. I did a number of projects. And after a certain period of time, I was to move to another facility. But like the management training program was designed for, if a leader, like a general manager of a business, liked your abilities and you were developing your skills, he or she may take you on and bring you into their operation under a specific role.
Okay.
So it was kind of like a, used car parking lot where, geez, that's a nice looking one over there. I might take that for a spin. And off I went. I was in the Kitchener plant. I was supposed to go out west to Red Deer, Alberta, and work in the bone after 6 months of projects. And my first project was on the slaughter line, and it was to find a way to separate water from blood, which was affecting our vitamin business that our Canada Packers had. They used every
That's
part of the animal. And so I did a bunch of studies and I got
Hmm.
very dirty and I understood much more about manufacturing. I really liked the food industry and particularly the culture of the meat industry.
Huh.
Believe it or not, the camaraderie was unreal. And so when I had the opportunity to stay at our Kitchener operation, where this my most recent project was, because they hooked me and pulled me in, I thought, okay, well, what am I going to do? And they said, well, we'll bring you in as a production clerk, which is essentially an accounting role. And so I went from industrial engineering, while I still continued that education. I set up a laboratory there. They didn't have a fat analysis lab and they didn't do very much in the way of microbiology. They were farming it all out. And I just set one up, hired a couple of co op students, and got that rolling while I still kept some of my IE projects going. And I also did the clerical job, which was efficiency reporting, energy reporting, and doing reconciliation of ARAP for maintenance, which I discovered I was really bad
Sorry,
at.
what's the AR and
And
AP?
accounts receivable, accounts
Gotcha.
payable. So I was lining up purchase orders with invoices, with
Okay.
documents, and yeah, I wasn't. I'm really glad I didn't become a CPA because it was not my strength, the rigor around. So, but I learned it and I learned the essentials around that. I learned the analysis of operations, which I really enjoyed around efficiency. So I took my science education and I invested back in contribution to the business by starting up a lab and helping with microbiology. And I felt that was use of my
Mhm.
education to continue to reinvest and contribute to the business
Yeah.
by doing what they didn't have, and they were reinvesting in me, teaching me a continuing education around industrial engineering, and b around basic operational accounting and efficiency measurements, clerical work, and that really taught me how a career really works. And the career really is best designed in what can you contribute and what does the company invest in you for your development. And as you evolve and develop in your career, you continue to reinvest what you've learned. So as I progressed, I wanted to learn more and more areas of the business. So I was in fresh meats slaughter for a little over a year, and then I moved into our chemicals division, and I worked in the biochemicals plant where we extracted gelatin from pig skins and bones, and all like
Yeah.
didn't waste any part of the animal. So, and it went into pharmaceutical grade. So it was a completely different
Yeah.
industry than primary slaughter. And I moved out of the clerical and the engineering part into direct production supervision. As I was moving through, I supervised a cutting line operation. I trained as a production floor supervisor in the meat packing plant. Then I went to the gelatin plant in the same company and was a shift supervisor working rotating shifts. But now it's a chemical plant, and I could get back to looking at ion exchange, thermal processes, and so on. And I really started to enjoy flexing my technical knowledge while still developing my leadership skills. So they were teaching me all about leadership development, health and safety, around even payroll management, interpersonal relations, labor relations. And I evolved over about 3 years of that. And I had had enough of shift rotating. And I was promoted to plant manager, and I looked after the whole facility, which included areas that I had minimal experience with, which would be the boiler plant and the refrigeration plant where they had stationary engineers, and it was a very
Mhm.
challenging environment, as well as maintenance, as well as quality assurance, as well as production, and so on. And as a very young guy, it was a very interesting opportunity, and I have a very strong affinity for production. So as I'm moving my way through, I'm continuing to take courses and continuing to develop myself, but I'm so far from the lab at this
Yeah.
point. It's I wondered, when am I ever going to get back to possibly a career in quality assurance? And so after about 7 years of production direct operations, I moved into a role where I was a quality assurance manager. And then I had moved back into fresh pork slaughter, which was the Burlington operation, which now is Sofina Foods, but it used to be Maple Leaf Pork in
Okay.
Burlington. And the company was sold to Maple Leaf or became part of Maple Leaf Foods. And I had my first capital project there. I went from QA manager to manufacturing manager, looking after the processed meats operation. And my first capital project with Maple Leaf was my second capital project, because in 1991 I had expanded the gelatin plant significantly and learned about a bit about applying some of the engineering skills that I was learning. And so I did it again. It was my second major capital project. I was pretty young, 31 or so, and fairly battle hardened, but it was a big plant. There was about 1,500
Wow.
employees, and it was a dynamic environment. I was up to about my 11th year with Maple Leaf, and then the company was taking on the union. There was a number of challenges around stability of the business in Burlington. There was a suspicion that the operation was going to move to Virginia,
Okay.
and fix some of the economics that were a challenge in the business. And I thought, well, want to start a family, really don't want to be migrating around the continent. And so I had an opportunity to leave the company and join Robin Hood Multifoods in their bakery division as manufacturing and logistics manager. And so I accepted it and went into the baking industry from predominantly fresh meats. And so applying what I learned in the way of efficiency and operations and production, and I had done a couple of union negotiations and so on. So some of my labor relations skills I had evolved and developed. I was looking at a toolbox. There's the technical skills, there's the
Mhm.
management skills, there's the leadership skills, human resources, and so on. A little bit of product development and technical
Mhm.
research and development stuff in there as well. And then I had this chance to learn logistics, demand planning and production planning. And I thought, manufacturing is easy. I can look after that probably in my sleep. But the logistics part is going to be a learning curve for me. And it was a great dynamic couple of years of planning. Unfortunately, the business closed after a couple of years I was there. And I decided, what am I going to do? I've worked for two of the largest food companies in Canada. And, I'm really not sure. My wife was working at Ford in Oakville. We had a bit of a commute, and I thought, I'll take a little bit of time and think about it. And in that
Mhm.
4 months I was thinking about it, I had a chance to join another bakery, but it was private investors. So family owned, privately owned company. Two brothers owned it, and we were building it. They really liked the company. So I had a chance to become a director of operations with oversight of three operations. One was a CFIA federally inspected pasta and entree plant, a meat slicing and sandwich assembly plant near Ottawa, and then our 100,000 square foot industrial bakery in Toronto. And it was very diverse operations,
Clearly.
and I had a chance to then build a bigger team, strengthening, three plant managers, a general manager under me, and really developing my skills in a big job as opposed to the more linear thinking that you require for, departmental. So as you can see, I was diverting
Yes.
and broadening my spectrum and knowledge. And so, but it was constantly rewarding me with opportunity, because the more I learned and the more I contributed, the better the rewards were. In other words, the better opportunities. For me, I wasn't really motivated by money as much as I was motivated by opportunity, and the opportunity to, one, contribute and demonstrate my abilities, and two, be reinvested in development. And so going to a privately held company was our first time I ever had to sign checks, and was responsible for understanding cash flow and the responsibility. We had 400 employees overall, and that responsibility, because you're pretty dialed into it, was new to me. It wasn't like you're buried in this large company. So and there was two brothers who were the partners, and it was interesting. Privately held companies, especially family run companies, have emotions involved, and they have an interesting, unique dynamic that I mastered. One of the owner's wives would babysit my kids. I would get to know his kids and, travel
Mhm.
together. And it was almost like family, which sometimes can be negative when you're not getting along. And so I quite often, the two brothers were my age and maybe a little younger and way better looking, but they would fight like cat and dog. And When you're in the middle of that, it was new for
Mhm.
me. And so the emotions and managing privately held companies was another evolution in my career. And so getting to know how that dynamic works and in, privately owned companies, even if it's 30 to 50 million dollars, it's a significant responsibility personally. And the money is really important at that point because it goes from the customer into your bank, paid out, and hopefully there's something left over at the end to reward the investors. Fast forward, I became an equity partner in the business, a minority partner, and that was the next evolution in my
Mhm.
career was that ultimate responsibility as a director of a company and the dynamics around that. And perhaps how, a board of directors works and the dynamics around egos and things
Mhm.
like that. And but great friendships and relationships developing in through that. And so mastering basic operations of a business, learning how to manage the economics of a business, cost of goods sold, relationships with customers, things like that. I really never strengthened my skills in sales. I
Mhm.
helped, but it's not an area that I think I learned enough early enough, but I certainly handle all the co-packing agreements and negotiated, simpler things that I would like to pretend were sales, but they really weren't. That was the one area of the business I really didn't spend a lot of time in. I do have some experience, but I have the luxury of working with some pretty amazing salespeople
Mhm.
now, and I can't shine their shoes. So they're quite good. There's only a certain amount of time in your career that you can learn
Yeah.
everything. But I really enjoyed the opportunities to learn. And so I moved from industry to industry. I mastered, meat production, processed meats, certainly bakery. I moved into the entree business, which was meals assembled and frozen. Then after that company was sold off and one of the majority shareholders bought the whole company out and took it in a different direction, I went to another family owned company because by then I had mastered, after about 10 years, I had really mastered family working relationships in ownership of an enterprise that's, 50, $60 million, maybe 80 in size. And so the family that owned Wings Food Products recruited me and brought me on board. And it was legitimately a founder of the company was very much involved in the business in his 80s.
Wow.
And the next generation, all super smart, really well educated, a couple of master's degrees, and one fellow I got an IQ. Neil has an IQ of about 175. He's the smartest human I ever met. And so really bright group of presidents, each running their own part of the company. So the second generation was operating the business, eventually moved on to take over and manage the dynamics of how they operate the business amongst themselves because everybody wants to be the president. And it can be, and everyone has their opinion and they have a vested interest in it. And so it's moved so far from kilograms per labor hour and efficiencies and thermodynamics and things. Those are just tools in my
Mhm.
toolbox. I pull out the drawer, I pull out the wrench. That's what I need to use at this moment. Whether it be microbiology or chemistry or basic logistics calculations or something like that, those are just tools. And the leadership and management skills are things that you evolve over time. And that's really where a career can do well. There are lots of people who really like to get into one stream, let's say finance and accounting, and move their way up, become the controller, then become the CFO, and that's their happy place. Wasn't what I was destined to do. The folks back at Canada Packers saw that I had natural leadership skills. I had this ability to manage multiple unrelated things at the same time, and I really enjoyed it. And I loved giving back as much as I
Mhm.
do. So in this process, I started applying for grants for some of the capital projects I was doing along the way. I think I built about 7 major construction operations, and I watched in the news other companies getting approved for grants. I'm like, how do I
Yes.
keep getting turned down? Doesn't
Yeah.
this work for me? I fill in the forms right. So I called a friend of mine at the City of Toronto, who's the food specialist, Mike Wolfson, who you should interview. Good friend of mine. Anyway, he said, Doug, talk to my boss and talk to this person and this person, this person, this person, and join these following associations. I talked to her, pretty much repeated the same thing that the head of economic development, City of Toronto. I had the luxury of people giving me great advice. So I joined the Toronto Industrial Network, the South Etobicoke Industrial Employers Association. I joined what was the Alliance of Ontario Food Processors, which became Food and Beverage Ontario a couple of years later. I was on the board of directors there. I joined Provision Coalition, which was a sustainability, as a member of the board of directors. And you really, once you get on the inside of giving back to the industry, you really start to understand the nuances of the broader economic impact. And then you can, your lens, you're looking at it through the public funds lens, as opposed to the lens of a hungry business person who just wants his ROI.
Yes.
How well do public funds get deployed? And so I learned that part of it, and I wanted to master it. So as I was listing earlier, I'm on the board of directors of Food and Beverage Ontario. I'm the chair of the Agricultural Adaptation Council board of directors, and we do public funding, program delivery. I was at one point on the board of directors of Provision Coalition when they were not for profit. I ran and chaired an organization called the Agricultural Management Institute, which eventually closed, but it was like a training institute for food business knowledge. I sit on the board of directors of Meat and Poultry Ontario, and I have the luxury of being on the vice chair of the Innovation Advisory Council for the Food Innovation Network of Canada, Canadian Food Innovation Network. And so learning the process of how public funds and a bunch of other stuff that I'm giving back. So giving back my time to the industry, I learned how programs work, how funding works, and how public investment back in our industry really drives economic development, because this industry has been incredibly good for me. So why not give back my time? And karma being what it is, it really does come back to reward you. So my career advanced further. I had the opportunity to take over as director of engineering for Ippolito Fruit and Produce here in Burlington, shorten my commute somewhat, 8 minutes from an hour, and it was a pleasure. And I worked with a really great family-run business. Had the chance to build a couple plants and expand some lines and have some serious technical input. I helped the company in Waterloo develop the first hyperspectral imaging system. It was like a really fancy Spec 20. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. Look at how, getting older, but I'm still able to apply what I learned in the beginning in concert. So I really was, really enjoying that. And I haven't bought one yet, even though that was 7 years ago. But they've done very well. I helped them grow and develop their business just because I like them and I wanted them to be successful. And what a moment of pride to have the first hyperspectral imaging system on Earth.
So cool. Like, so cool.
LaForge's glasses in a factory looking at stuff. And they could, they're really smart folks doing AI and applying machine learning to take the chemistry, the terabytes of data of chemistry, and figure out, using randomized algorithms, where the stuff came from, what acreage the spinach was grown in, and
cool.
The polyphenols content of it, and it was really cool. So the drudgery of responsibility to a business and a job, combined with some pretty cool stuff, makes it fun. And so that's that investment and return. I could invest in the business and provide what I knew reasonably well. I was no expert, but I could talk a good game. And the reward was I got this opportunity to advance and move through the company. And then I joined Premium Brands Holdings. My boss, Paul Roach, who's our CEO of our business group, asked me to join because I was a lot like the fellow who was running our business in Aurelia, Ledbetter Foods, but a hands-on operator, more of an entrepreneur, less of a chartered accountant, more of could run a sausage making machine, or could smoke and ham bacons and hams and so on. So I took that on for a few years as VP and general manager, and then marketing and sales is not my strength. So I did mention that
Hmm.
a couple times. There are far better people at it than me. So I was given an opportunity to take because I had somehow become a part of our corporate ESG committee. I opened my mouth and I said, here's how sustainability works. Here's what ESG is all about. And I got volunteered into the committee to
Yeah.
help reinvest. And it continues. The I can contribute what I know, and then the reward is
Hmm.
opportunity to participate in some pretty cool stuff. So I've really slid into this sustainability government relations piece. While we brought in a professional marketing guy to run our business in Aurelian, he's done a
Amazing.
really good job up there building building a great brand and expanding bacon business, which, as you know, is meat can. Now, my role now, I'm still learning. In fact, right here, I've got cap and trade and carbon offsets and the
Hmm.
analysis of how that works. I've got the differentiation between scope one, two, and three. And I've learned the GRI and I've learned a bit about sustainability. People think I know a lot about it. I'm just learning and reinvesting what I'm learning. And that's been most of my career.
That is a heck of a career. Wow.
Yeah, but sometimes they make mistakes too. There's been in there between the learning, there's been
And that was
mistakes and
actually
learning.
something that I did kind of want to dive into because the way you're talking about your story, everything just seemed to flow as you're talking about it. Well, I came to here and I came to here. And I know obviously on the surface, like that is definitely not going to be the case. But one of the main themes, as you've already said, is that you've really looked at your career in what can I give in order to get to the next opportunity and such. And one of the things I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that because I think coming out of school, you might not have a lot of these skills and like how did you deal with that mental sorry, how do I want to say this? Did you actively search out the next roles each time or was it something that you were just on the floor doing your thing, and then you, like, mentioned an offhand comment, and someone is like, "Oh, here's a job that I would like." Is that how how did it go?
Career development and evolution is a skill. So I have and I still get calls for opportunities. And so the best way to develop and grow is within the same company. That for sure is the best. Doesn't always work out that way. Companies, it used to be job for life
Mhm,
was the way that my mother described the food industry. You got a job for life. And everyone I worked with at Canada Packers, that some of them are still probably working at Maple Leaf, had this mindset that I'm going to go work for this company and I'm going to retire here. Then 15 to 20 years later, the trend was more that you would have a career with about 7
mhm,
changes within your career. So maybe every 5 years, 6 years, you would move to something different into another company. And that was because companies either got bought, sold, or
mhm,
closed, or you got a boss that maybe there wasn't the chemistry that you really needed. And sometimes you got to make that hard decision that it's time to move on. And sometimes you have to make the decision that, this is an opportunity where if I have done a good job on succession planning, and that's where the giving back is. You have to develop and train your people. You
mhm,
absolutely have to take the people that are so giving back is also developing that next succession plan. And if you're quite good at it, or you're quite fortunate to have somebody to backfill you, moving to the next role becomes very important. So that's probably the most important message I can give is always ensure that you're giving back to your peers within work to provide them the same opportunities you have.
mhm.
It's not about competing and cutting each other's throats. It's about helping each other move forward. All boats rise with the tides. So it's worked very well for me. So those opportunities, I was able to move on because I
Mhm.
was able to develop people who could backfill, either to move into my role or into a team that could support the role. So I could move on. And then sometimes I would get promoted.
Yeah. I actually want to dive a little bit more even into that because I've never experienced a manager role. So like this is kind of new territory for me to learn a little bit more. And when you're referring to building someone up, like how so let's say you're a leader of a small team and such. What does it look like to invest in those that you're like leading? Like, what do you identify? Like, how do you like how does that happen? Like,
It's really very different. So managing technical people, there's actually courses you can take in that because that's a different system
really?
than managing operational people. You really got to know your audience
Okay.
because there's different cultures within the employment base. So some people are not like I said, everybody that went to Canada Packers through the management training program was going to become the president of the company. That those guys like me were easy to work with. They were a bit ambitious, they were hardworking, and they were motivated to learn and absorb
Mhm.
more. Had the pleasure of working with a young fella who had just entered the food industry a few years ago and was like a sponge, but he had similar attributes: ambition, willingness to learn, hardworking, and so reinvesting in him gave him an opportunity to do what I did years ago. And I could probably look back and mark on a list a lot of people. I've hired thousands of hourly people. I've had the pleasure of hiring a lot of salaried people and developing them. Not all have gone great.
Mhm.
It's a very difficult thing to do, but when you're building a team or you're working with your peers, it's an investment. They're investing in you in commitment to come to work and work like a team and help each other. Because the one thing about manufacturing is there's no one
Mhm.
person. It just
Yeah.
doesn't work like that. You have to get hundreds of people to work and coalesce together to generate packaged goods that people want to
Mhm.
buy. In the food industry, you want them to feel good about it too, and it's got to taste good. So developing those people is a bit of an art. You really have to it's there's been failures
Okay.
in there for me and successes where some people take on roles that they shouldn't, and some people don't get the opportunities that they'd like, and they do like I would do is move on before they get a chance to be promoted. But the key is stay in tune with your people, get to know them very well, understand the culture and the generations. So there is generational differences of what's important to people. And certainly now with this labor crisis that we all are facing, it is critical that we were worried in the 90s about boomers going to retire. So when in the 90s, all I heard about before you were born, well, what they were talking about at the time was what are we going to do when everybody retires? There won't be enough money. Everybody's got to put money into RSPs and invest. So we did that really, really well. And a lot of people have just recently left the workforce, about
Mhm.
25%. There wasn't the backfill because the boomer generation was a lot of humans and they all left very quickly because they did a good job on investing. What we didn't do in the 90s and was think about, well, who's going to replace us? Oh, it's just going to be automation and it's going to be paperless
Mhm.
society and all this dream. No, that didn't work. So we're in a real labor crisis that there isn't enough humans to do a lot of the work that we have. Great time to enter the workforce. I mean, I thought the 80s were a great time to enter work, and
Mhm.
it was very rewarding for me. Right now, it's a phenomenal time that the opportunities for young people are terrific. A lot of people are getting advanced well beyond their experience
Wow.
level. And that skill is important to manage. So folks like me have to become incredibly patient with people who are willing to take on greater responsibilities than what they really are prepared
Mhm.
for. In my day, you might have had 5 to 10 years to move into a role. Now people are moving into roles in 1 or 2 years or three, and they're not 100% prepared for what the onslaught is coming. So mentorship and coaching and teaching from the more senior people is the most important investment we can do. And so recognizing people's abilities and interest to
Mhm.
learn and investing in their areas of interest and continuing to do that is really important. Young people putting your hands up and saying, I'd like to learn this, I'd like to try that, and showing some initiative, not being afraid of it,
Yeah.
because we all make mistakes and have made lots of them throughout our career. You don't have enough time for me to go on about the mistakes I've made in my career, and things I wish I could have done
Hmm.
differently. But I learned from each and every one. And although at the moment it felt devastatingly horrible, I got over it. So did my
Yeah.
boss. And we moved on, and I learned something, and I tried not to do it ever again. And so young people have to really embrace, especially when they're taking on more than what they're really prepared for, because there's a vacuum and there's a need for people to move into broader responsibilities, areas outside of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
That that skill set and that fearless mentality, you got to be prepared to make mistakes, and you got to be prepared for your people to make mistakes, and you got to be prepared to reinvest and shore them up and protect them from failure as best you can, because it's going to happen, and you want to minimize the damage as much as
Mhm.
possible. Otherwise, you get paralysis and everything
Yeah.
stops. And that doesn't work very well when there's a shortage
Well,
of.
because the podcast is more directed to younger listeners, so you're mentioning about protecting from the employer standpoint, but, being fearless, it is scary. You're dealing with lots of money, lots of potential waste. The food industry is like, manufacturing is very fast-paced, and when it's felt when a day is not productive enough. So, how do you embrace fearlessness to know that you're going to make mistakes, but it's like, I feel like there's a range of mistakes, like, you feel like, "Well, if I mess up today, like, today's the day that I'm out." Like, how do you manage
So
that?
So some of the best people to hire are people that have been terminated. So if that happens to anyone, don't ever feel that bad that your career is
Hmm.
over. It's just a mistake. And another fellow who's interviewing you probably went through the same thing.
Huh.
So that lens, you'd have to be one arrogant individual to expect that no one is going to make mistakes. The best people out there who have made mistakes have the strong emotional intelligence to know what they've done wrong, and learn from it. And hopefully they've had, a team around them that can help them learn what went wrong and how do they prevent it and not be embarrassed or
Mhm.
ashamed about it. It's just part of learning. It's no different than going in and writing your grade 9 math test and failing it. Okay, well,
Uh,
you got to try a little harder and study a little
yeah.
more. It's not the end of the world. At the time, it might feel
Mhm.
like that. And you look back at it, it's like, oh, that's nothing. You should see what I can do now. I can really mess things up. So having it's important for managers to build up the confidence of young people. It's important for young people to look to somebody who's going to manage them well. That interpersonal relationship is important. Asking those questions ahead of time is really important. So the interviewing process, or the early part of your career, you take a job on, you go, I'd like to work in that area over there in a couple of years. I'd like to try that out, or maybe sooner. Ask questions. Maybe ask if you can participate in that department for a little while, just to learn it. Because if they're a smart manager, they're going to give you a chance, but you have to step up and speak up. You really have to. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, and lifelong learning. You really must do your homework. It's really important. If you're going to take something on that's new, don't assume you know anything about it. In fact, assume you know nothing about it. Make no assumptions, and make the effort to go back to first principles and learn. And where you don't, self-taught to a degree, and have other people teach you, maybe taking courses or learning at work. It comes from asking questions, building relationships with people you work with, and maybe helping out. Like if you have a spare 30 minutes, instead of playing some game, maybe help out a peer in another department and learn what they're doing, and maybe make their life a little easier. Maybe you learn a little bit about their department, like, accounts receivable or
Mhm.
payables, and learn how that works and how you balance cash flow. Although that may not be terribly exciting, but it's important to know long term about how a business functions. It's no
Mhm.
different than the physiology of a person. You've got to have blood or oxygen and things like that. Cash is what keeps a
Mhm.
business alive. So people lose sight of that. But especially technical people, if you work in quality assurance, you get a little bit isolated, particularly now where HACCP just overwhelms you, and
Yeah.
GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative. I've written a number of programs in both HACCP and in SQF and BRC, and that's daunting. Like just learning that is
Yep.
one thing. Move away from that to take on something else takes a bit of courage and interest. You don't necessarily have to quit what you're doing to learn something new in another area. Manage your time well, look and think about it. My career progressed in a manner that was
Hmm.
lateral and forward, and sometimes
Yeah.
backwards. I would take a step backwards to learn something that I didn't really master or know to be able to move forward later. And those are all things that in a career you think about, okay, what's the next course in business that I'm working in that I need to learn?
Yeah.
And that takes initiative, that takes asking questions, that takes relationships. You have to come out of your shell, talk to your peers around you and really and take advantage of both your boss, other managers within the business and human resources. And just talk about, hey, you know what? I'd like to take a little bit of time and understand a little bit more about this. And although we're all busy, it's very
Mhm.
important for good leaders to reinvest back in people like that.
I think that's so great. That's really good advice. And from what I've learned in my time, like as someone I've done some co-op positions in the food industry, I also did work in QA for a year. And one thing that I've been amazed about with this industry, Ontario, the food menu, is just the potential, and we've seen it with your career, is just the opportunities that are available that you don't necessarily have to go in saying, okay, well, I'm going to become the president, but you can just look at the next opportunity because I think you've also touched upon it that each of these facilities has their own culture. You know, a family owned business is going to feel different than that of maybe a larger organization. And there's a lot of potential to move around and see what works for you, to go for the next opportunity, to learn as much as you can. That it's just, so many opportunities that maybe other sectors won't give you. So that really is amazing.
And Facebook's pretty amazing to reconnect with old bosses. So my the first fellow who gave me an opportunity to move out of production supervision into plant management is a Facebook friend. He lives in Dallas, Texas now, and has retired. He doesn't remember the impact he had on my life. He just remembers the
Mhm.
relationship we had. But that guy taught me things about life that I could never, like, conversations like when you're in a high stress environment, it's like, have you thought about taking counseling? Have you thought about getting maybe some advice? That kind of human behavior is really important, not just to think about a person in terms of the job and the box that you work in, but think of them as a human
Mhm.
being. And when you see them under stress, give them some personal advice to help them get through that. Not just advice that you would be able to give them how to deal with it, maybe help where to find or advice where to find help, how to deal with it. And so that guy, whenever he answers my Facebook messages or posts, it takes you right back to that moment in
Mhm.
1988 or 89 when I was sweating bullets thinking, oh my God, how do I get through this? And he'd be right there, calmly help me get through it because he'd been through the same thing himself. I didn't know he had felt the same way until one day he took the time to tell me that. And that impacted my life tremendously
Mhm.
for the rest of my career. That genuine give back mentality. And there's been lots of managers and people I've worked with through my career that are close friends, people that have worked for me that don't hate me, that are still good friends of mine. One I talked to for 2 hours on the phone yesterday, who's just recently retired. Sometimes I thought he was going to kill me with working together, but really appreciated the relationship. And it's once you look past the rigors of business and the box that you're in at work and think of people as people and treat them as people,
Mhm.
then the dynamics change. And as a young person, you have to think of yourself the same way. I'm just a human being doing the best that I can, and I'm going to try and contribute, learn, reinvest in the business. And I hope that the business is going to reinvest back in me and teach me and develop me. And that's how your career path goes. Sometimes it means outside of the business, sometimes it means within the business. It really is just a matter of timing. And I'd like to believe that through my career, everything I left in my past are still see me the same way positively as I think of them now. And so even classmates from, back in college are still close to me, and we still advise each other like people how to deal with things in life. Some of it's work, some of it's just life challenges. And that's important in work because it's really a great deal of harmony between your personal life and your work
Mhm.
life. If you try to separate it, it's not going to be the same. You don't want to integrate too
Yeah.
much because that's unhealthy. But I think that when people recognize each other as just human beings and reinvest in them, things go very well and badly.
Well, I think I'm gonna end it there, even though I know that we could keep talking for another hour, maybe even 2, about a lot of different things that you spoke about, but
I
I
can.
know, but I think that's great. It just shows that you've had this rich career of many different experiences, and that you're just a person who's taken each opportunity, learned a little along the way, applied it, and just kept on going. So I'm gonna leave it there. So thank you so much, Doug, for taking time to come on the show. Before I do let you go, though, where can people find you?
Well, they can find me on LinkedIn like you did, and I'm usually pretty good at accepting. I'm happy to have you share my email address, and they can shoot me a
Okay.
note, and I'm happy to mentor and coach. They can look up Food and Beverage Ontario. I'm on the
Mhm.
website, or on Meat and Poultry Ontario, or Agricultural Adaptation Council, and they can reach me through there. But the easiest thing would be for me to give you my work email, and you could post it on there. People could write me and ask me as long as they're not trying to sell me duck. I'm good.
I can't make promises on that one, but I will make sure to share that in the notes. So again, thank you, Doug, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Veronica, for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and you have a great evening.
That was episode 65 of the Food Grads podcast. All the notes to this podcast can be found by clicking on the Student and Grads tab on the Food Grads website. There, you can find any notes to past or future episodes. If you enjoyed this episode, then please head over to wherever you listen to this episode and rate it 5 stars. This helps us get the word out about the podcast and share how great the industry is. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening. I know that you could be listening to anything else right now, but you chose us. So, again, thank you. So, I got into contact with Doug after I put out a call on LinkedIn looking to interview individuals more on the manufacturing side of the food industry. Ask and you shall receive. As you can tell from Doug's journey, he has had a long, fulfilling career in the manufacturing side of the food industry. From quality departments to production to sustainability, Doug has put in the effort and hard work into each of his roles and made sure to place focus on learning. It seems as though being a lifelong learner has really led to opening more doors for him and more opportunities. This reminds me of something that I have heard about the industry is that they like to hire within the food industry. I heard this recently when I was going over a mentorship session Food Grads did with the Careers Now. I just recently put out the blog post on that. But the advice that they gave was that the key to growing in an organization is make sure that you let your supervisor know that you want to move up within an organization or industry and be willing to put in the extra work. It sounds as though Doug has used this tactic to his benefit over the course of his career. Although I say it on the podcast and we hear a lot of advice, you know, networking is great, but sometimes at the end of the day, putting in the hard work is just what you're going to have to do in order to push your career forward. Networking is great, but you also have to have the results to back it up. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening, and I will see you next time.
No,